Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest roundtable event, Excellence in Board Leadership, Navigating Complex Challenges. I'm Lorraine DeBono, Managing Partner at FLG Partners, which is the leading interim CFO, COO, and board advisory firm in the US, and we serve clients globally. Today, we have with us three highly experienced FLG partners and CFOs, Ken Chow, Ron Fior, and Jeff Kuhn, each with more than 25 years as senior executives and CFOs at both private and public companies. They also have been key advisors to boards of directors, and each has served as a member of a public or private company board. So welcome, panelists, and let's get started. As we begin the second quarter of 2022, we're all facing new challenges, particularly at the board level. What I'm currently seeing as a lead independent director of a public company is that boards are more in demand and also being held more accountable. Board members are very focused on current market and global conditions and how these conditions impact their companies. There are more frequent board meetings, and executive teams and boards are working much more closely together and more rigorously to ensure that current market conditions, such as supply chain issues, commodity scarcity, inflation worries, all of them don't engulf or overwhelm their companies. So with no further ado, let's get started with the panelists. And Jeff, let's start with your perspective. What are you seeing in terms of current board issues and topics of discussion?
God, what boards aren't seeing. First, in this, obviously, the post-COVID paradigm, supporting remote work, trying to understand what that means, and return to work policies, compensation and competition for talent and rising compensation pressures. Of course, the Ukrainian war and the geopolitical situation, what that is doing to supply chains, and in fact, customer relationships. As always, high vigilance around cyber risk, continued opportunities around digital transformations, such as cryptocurrencies, AI, automation, volatile financial markets with spiking inflation, rising interest rates, and what that means for access to the capital markets and M&A. And lastly, increased focus on environmental, social, and governance, otherwise known as ESG reporting, and of course, board diversity. So boards have plenty to think about right now.
I could not agree with you more, Jeff, with your thoughts about the current issues facing boards. And it's really quite a crazy time right now in the world. But this really frames the context around today's conversation. So now let's get you, Ron, into the conversation. So you've been a CFO of numerous private and public companies. You know boards well. And so from your perspective, what are the most effective traits, we should say, of board members, and what do you think are those shared several common traits that make a really good board member?
Thanks, Lorraine. In my experience, I think there's really three key traits. Firstly, they need to be committed to doing what it takes to serve on a board. We've all experienced that one board member who's consistently trying to read ahead on the documents and see as the meeting progresses.
Oh, yeah.
They ask questions that are answered elsewhere in the pre-read, and they effectively disrupt the meeting. It's a basic requirement. You need to be ready to put in the time, do the pre-reads if you're going to sit on a board. Another facet of that commitment is to be willing to be part of a team and to be willing to share your networks and leverage your unique experiences. That's a really helpful part of this process. Secondly, they really need to be independent.
Mm-hmm.
Often when a company is in its early development stages, you'll find this board is made up of friends of the founder. This is okay initially. As the company grows, though, the challenges become more complicated, in particular at a public company. It is extremely important to not simply have an echo chamber. The board members need to be objective and impartial. They need to be willing to debate constructively and ask tough questions. This is another critical trait. Finally, they need to be knowledgeable. Knowledge is a function of training and diversity of experience. In my opinion, an effective board has members that are knowledgeable, given their diverse backgrounds and experiences. It's this diversity that brings the high level of credibility, whether it be technical, industry related, situational, etc. The breadth of their team's experience really enables the development of a holistic view of situations or challenges that come up, whether they be vision, mission, operational challenges, management challenges, legal, financial, cultural, or ethics related. You need to use that group's collective knowledge and their experiences, and then you'll get a great outcome. There are, of course, all sorts of other traits that are important, but I believe the three mentioned, in my mind, are the most critical.
I completely agree with you, Ron. And I think, again, for our audience, commitment, independence, knowledge are really three key traits. What I would also add, though, Ron, from my own personal experience, is the ability to persuade and the ability to collaborate. What I have found is if you find these two traits also in board members, the work of the board gets done much more faster and with much more ease. So I find those two things also quite invaluable.
Completely agree. Those are really important.
Yeah, for sure. Let's turn to Ken now. So Ken, you have vast experience as a board director. What are some of the softer attributes that you believe differentiate between an average director and a great director?
That's a really interesting question, Lorraine. From my perspective, the skills that make a great leader are the same exact skills that differentiate a great board member.
Mhm.
Here's a few. Be strategic.
Mhm.
Stay focused on the big picture and think outside the box regarding the company's toughest challenges. Also, be a leader. Consistently demonstrate the attributes of great leadership: listening, collaborative teamwork, being curious, and building consensus, because most of the work on a board gets done not in the board meeting, but really at the committee level. Be passionate.
Mhm.
You got to be passionate. It's the only way to be great at doing something. Being part of being a great director is being highly engaged and showing that you care. And if you're not passionate about what you're doing, then really you should do something else. Another one I really consider is being a great communicator. It's critical to be effective at communication and building those great relationships and cultivating those those interactions with both internal and external stakeholders. And the last one I'd probably say is just be supportive. Management teams are tasked with building and running the business. So one of the best things that a director can do is really question management's decisions, but be supportive. This may include becoming a mentor for some of the management team members.
Mhm.
Let me give you just a really quick example. I was on the board of a private vision systems company that was having difficulty penetrating its market. And the root cause was the system just wasn't accurate enough to meet customer expectations. So management proposed re-architecting the entire product platform and adding some features. We as a board, we were supportive, but we also asked tough questions around why re-architect, what's the technological feasibility, and really what's the desired outcome. The proposal led to the management team having to go back and building a new set of cost estimates and stronger business case. They were submitted the proposal back to the board 4 weeks later, and with the board support, executed on those changes. 6 months later, we launched that platform, and it led to really revenue generating trials with companies like Deloitte and H&M, as well as a number of others. So again, I would just say, be curious, collaborative, and supportive of management, and this will lead to a more successful outcome.
I could not agree with you more, Ken. And those are great pearls of wisdom for the audience. And let me share with the audience my own story of being on a board and how that ability to persuade is so important. I was on a board several years ago of a public specialty pharma company, and the company had signed a merger agreement, but at a subsequent board meeting, the CEO and chair wanted to increase the comp packages of the executive team without the approval of the acquirer, which, by the way, is a complete fiduciary no-no. So I was the youngest person on the board. I was the newest person on the board, only 6 months on the board, and I raised my hand. And I said, you know, I get it. I understand. There's probably great reasonableness in doing this. However, do we have a legal opinion of counsel that doing it is okay? Do we have an opinion of the auditors that this is affordable? And then, oh, by the way, any material change in the business needs to be approved by the acquirer. So we really need to think this through. I think there was a little bit of a gasp in the audience, and we took a break at the board meeting. And what I then did is I brought the audit committee together and we talked about it as a team. And I really do feel that in that context, my ability to persuade and influence my committee members was most important, because guess what? What we did was we then went back to the board and said, I think we need to do what has been asked of us by Lorene. So the great news there is that we did the right thing. We really used our fiduciary responsibilities, and ultimately, when we did suggest the package to the acquirer, ultimately about 75% of what was asked for was ultimately included in the final comp package and approved. So a great outcome, but where, you know, you have to be courageous and you have to raise your hand and say something doesn't sound quite right here. So I think this is a great segue to Jeff, who can now explain to our audience more about what is meant by a board's corporate fiduciary responsibility. So Jeff?
Well, the first thing a board member needs to understand and always keep top of mind is who it is they're representing on the board, and it isn't themselves. Directors have a legal responsibility and a duty of care to the shareholders and the other stakeholders above and beyond any personal interests that a board member may have. The duty of care includes adequate information, thorough consideration of the benefits and risks to the shareholders. It's a duty of loyalty and trust in the best interest of the corporation, free from conflicts of interest. And the duty of care can't be delegated. You can't pass this off to the CEO. You individually have a deep duty of care, and collectively, of course, as the board. And a current stark example of how this is working or not working, as the case may be, is Elon Musk's current pursuit of Twitter.
Exactly.
Purely as a shareholder, he has no fiduciary obligation to anybody. And he's free to largely do what he wants to do in his personal self-interest, however he may define that, which may be to the detriment of Twitter's other stakeholders and employees. However, if he were to become a director, he could not act in his self-interest, regardless of the size of his ownership, but would have to first honor his duty of care to the company and the stakeholders, even at the expense of his self-interest, which is doubtless why he didn't take a board seat. So this is foremost that a lesson to and obligation of directors. This is what they have to keep in mind all the time.
I completely agree, Jeff, and that's a great example for our audience. And it'll be interesting to see how this whole thing plays out with Twitter, because number one, they've invoked their poison pill. And I think just a couple of days ago, Elon Musk has said that he's going to start a tender offer on the company. So it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. As a board advisor, I'm often asked, what are the essentials when it comes to excellence in board governance? So let's turn to you, Ron, and how would you answer that question?
So when I think about it, corporate governance is really the foundation upon which, an organizations are able to set their strategy, channel resources, mitigate risks, and hold management accountable for company performance. Board actions must ultimately strive to deliver value for the company's stakeholders. We heard just earlier here. More and more, that simple overriding goal is being augmented by the environmental, social, and governance requirements, as we know, better known as ESG. Boards need to establish at least 3 committees in which most of the work is done: audit, compensation, and nominating and governance. Governance initiatives often include activities such as evaluating strategy change, recommending policy changes, and succession planning, a very important one.
Oh, yeah.
Effective boards actively engage around both the company's long-term vision and adapting quickly to new challenges. They regularly consider diverse perspectives, thoroughly vet issues, and assist in finding solutions and opportunities for success. One especially effective way to make sure the board is engaging and thinking about their activities in a holistic way is to have management, the CEO, the CFO, the general counsel, develop a calendar of activities based on committee charters and general needs. Then you need to get the board to review the calendar and make sure they all agree to their participation.
Completely agree. The concept of an agreed to calendar for the board is just a great idea. This way, everybody from the company executives to board members stay on the same page. So for you in the audience, think about that as a board member to make for sure that you're working from one of those kinds of calendars. So now let's turn to Ken. And Ken, when it comes to board leadership and board effectiveness, what, from your perspective, are some of the best practices?
It's serious stuff. And each board member has many responsibilities, and implementing best practices helps both boards and management be more effective. So here's a few best practices to consider. Establishing clear roles and responsibility for board members. Just be explicit. There's no there can be no ambiguity over who's responsible for what. Create a culture of transparency. This is a critical best practice because no one likes to get surprised. It's transparency that establishes that credibility and trust, which are the basis for any relationship.
For sure.
Build strong relationships with other board members and as well as management. These are the people you're working with. This will include regular communications via committees, executive sessions, and also informal discussions. Develop effective board reporting, both content frequency and the appropriate level of detail for the board. This will provide the necessary insights and serve as the basis for strong decision making. This is also shared responsibility between the board and management to know what a board expects and for management to deliver on those expectations.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things I think about is document outcomes well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All board decisions must be documented well through either board or committee minutes, reporting or disclosures. For example, how many times have you seen board members reading or even the management drafting those board minutes right before the next meeting?
Mm-hmm.
Take documentation really seriously. And I'd add the last point that I think about from a best practices perspective: create a defined board onboarding process. So one of the best practices that is often overlooked when someone joins a board. And the objective is really to get that new board member up to speed as quickly as possible. Many companies don't do this. Mm-hmm. And they don't have an established onboarding process, which will add clarity and drive effectiveness for each new board member. Consider assigning a board buddy, in fact, for new board members. Ron had talked about, a calendar. That's part of this whole onboarding process.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I recently joined a board of Alliant Credit Union, a top 10 credit union in the US, and their onboarding process was excellent. With clear monthly, quarterly, and annual processes, and with effective communication about expectations, including which committees I was going to join, which was both talent and supervisory, which is basically their audit committee. The structure and clarity for each board member's role and responsibility is very clear at Alliant. I think that's a group that is very well organized and pretty buttoned down.
Those are great points, Ken, for our audience. And again, what I call good board hygiene, right, is extremely important. And that really starts, when you think about it, with the board candidate vetting process, right? And it goes all the way through that onboarding process. And then, to Ron's point, making sure that board meetings are efficiently done. There's a calendarization of what's going to be going on at each board meeting and that sort of thing. So what we're going to do now, audience, is pivot to a different but a very critical topic, which is risk management. And as you all are aware, risk management has become ever more complex in this era of a global economy, concerns about data privacy, cyber warfare, regulatory, supply chain issues, litigation risk, you kind of name it, right? So let's turn to Jeff. Jeff, how would you recommend boards ensure that they're optimally prepared to mitigate against risk at their companies?
Well, first, risk management in large companies is typically handled by a specific committee called the risk committee. But in smaller companies, it's often left to the audit committee to handle risk management. First is conduct your due diligence as a board of the company. Talk with the executive teams about the risks they see or foresee for the business, and dig in, go down, not just at the C level. Conduct these risk assessments for future performance impact, both short-term and long-term. Engage in scenario building. Gameplay what risks would be for the company and how you would manage them. Understand the full continuum of options for risk mitigation, including crisis planning. Ensure that the company has a full suite of insurance, D&O, property, E&O, cybersecurity, business interruption, product liability, you name it. There's a whole bunch of them. Have dedicated risk management teams in the management structure, sometimes specifically designated for certain types of risk, ready to engage immediately. And this means having the so-called black book on the shelf that you pull down and use. You've already got it all figured out. Identify a specific person who will be the sole spokesperson for the company during a crisis. It's crucial that the company have a unified response to any questions that are coming from media and stakeholders. If the company is big enough, that means engaging a crisis management consulting firm on a standby basis who is familiar with the company, who's ready to jump in when something happens. When something happens, act immediately, be completely honest, own the problem, and overcorrect whatever the error may be. And the classic example of this done well, pardon me, is the way Johnson & Johnson handled the Tylenol scandal. Their response turned a disaster into a huge win for the brand. Lastly, risk management also includes succession planning amongst the executive team. This is a conversation that boards need to have no less frequently than annually, with dedicated and identified successors in case something suddenly happens to the CEO or the CFO, for example, where you're not wandering around with no plan. Somebody needs to be the next man up, if you will, and ready to go. And make sure that these plans percolate throughout the organization, build relationships with key managers both below the C level, and maintain communication with them. Those are mine.
I think those are great points. I actually remember the Tylenol scare and all of the issues surrounding that. And I remember that I think it was Jim Burke, right, Jeff, the CEO of J&J, that became the sole spokesperson for Tylenol and J&J. And I thought that he did a great job. And as I remember, that allowed the J&J stock to bounce pretty quickly back. So again, it's a perfect example of one spokesperson during a crisis and overcorrect and get it done right. Now let's turn to actually the management of a crisis itself, which is really the heart of mitigating risk. So Ken, one of the truest tests of a board of directors during a crisis, be it a pandemic, a shareholder activist, an unexpected C-suite resignation, et cetera, is how directors rise to action during a crisis. So what are the best tips for a director managing through these different types of crises?
It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when a board will actually have to deal with a crisis. And in those situations, you just got to move fast. Massive business disruptions, it will require to have those flexible, agile plans to deal with changing circumstances during the crisis. And I think Jeff had talked a little bit about that. It's where board experience really becomes so valuable. So the first step I would say is you have to have that great crisis management plan. And so you've got to do that. You've got to have it all ready. You've got to prep way before. And so When you're in the middle of the crisis, you now have the reference point. I think Jeff had mentioned the black book, so to speak.
Right, the plan.
Yeah, the plan. And you've got to simulate. I know Jeff had referred to simulating, but really do a walkthrough. Take it seriously, because you won't have time to react. You've got to know what to do, and then you just execute. The second thing is really what happens when you're in the middle of the crisis, and what's the communication plan with the company's stakeholders? How should you engage with key stakeholders, and what priority when the crisis happens? Who's the spokesperson? And it does need to be one voice. What's the plan for engaging with investors? And over communicate. Do not take it lightly. You've got to take it seriously. And more is better in this situation. Sometimes, less is better, but in crisis management, better communication will help you manage through and create the right expectations. The last point I'd probably say is that, once you're in this crisis and you're actively managing it, you've got to launch all your plans. That means focus on public relations, investor relations, and also internal communications. Don't forget about your employees. Deploy the specific domain experts, and your focus is to safeguard the assets of the company. Let me give you a personal example of a crisis that I helped to manage through in the early stage of the pandemic. I was assisting a client as the interim CFO, and our company had manufacturing and service operations in India and around the world. The pandemic really caused an immediate shutdown of all our operating centers. The good news was that we had a contingency plan. We had a plan that we could execute against. The bad news was that it moved so fast because the government literally shut down all operations, and we had to shift to a work from home strategy in a blink of an eye. It was tough. The board and the management really collaborated, and we were successful in maneuvering through this situation. But it was a crisis, and I think other companies had some of the same kind of experience, kind of having to deal with the onset of the pandemic. Now, turning to today, just look at the current supply chain issues that are caused by the lockdown in Shanghai right now, and how's that impacting both lead times and really companies and really the economy. So the bottom line is that a crisis is really a true test of boards and management and what they're made of.
I completely agree. And in fact, just a funny little vignette. I was driving over the Bay Bridge the other day, and I think I counted 25 cargo container ships just sitting there, kind of waiting to be loaded or unloaded. I have actually never seen that before in my 42 years of living in the Bay Area.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but it really speaks, right, Ken, to the supply chain issues that we're all experiencing, and that I'm sure boards and executive teams are dealing with as we speak. So it's a big issue. So now, again, let's pivot and let's turn to our final subject, which is how to prepare to be on a board, how to be a good board member, and how to get on a board. So let's start, Ron, with you. I know many in our audience are aspiring board directors. So what advice would you give them in terms of how to prepare for the role?
You're on mute, Ron.
Ron, I think you're on mute.
Got it. Sorry.
No worries.
So anyways, first off, you need to be networking. It's so important. Public company, private company, nonprofit, each of those types of boards has their own networks. Private companies tend to have board members representing key venture capitalists or other investors, as well as members from the CEO's personal network. Public companies tend to look for more independent members with specific expertise. Again, networking is absolutely critical. Be clear on your value to the board. What expertise can you offer them? How can you add value? That is another one that's really, really critical. Understand what liability means as a board member.
Oh, you betcha.
Yeah, this is something that is critical to understand. Yes, there is risk to being a board member. It's not just nice. You don't get to just sit on the board and do, have meetings and get some stock and listen. You actually have to do things, and your actions can have an impact. So you need to make sure you have an indemnification agreement and make sure you understand the terms of it and your D&O coverage. You need to make sure you have adequate D&O coverage and that you're covered appropriately. These are very, very important things to consider as you join a board. Finally, take advantage of the resources out there, including the National Association of Directors, it's the NACD, and things like the Stanford Director College, which are just amazing to attend.
I completely agree in terms of educational resources. NACD is great. Totally agree with you, Ron. And Stanford Directors College, for those of you who are in the Bay Area, it's expensive, but it is totally worth it. I've done it myself a couple of times and completely worth it. And then going back to one other point for our audience that Ron mentioned, which is D&O. I know more directors who have joined boards without really looking at that policy. Guys, look at that policy up, down, and sideways. Even talk to your personal lawyer if you want. But knowing what D&O is, what you're protected for is super important. And get that indemnification agreement with the company on whose board you're going to serve. Also get that executed as well. So thank you, Ron, for mentioning that. I would also underscore the importance of networking with everyone you know if you want to get on a private or public company board. That means bosses, service providers, peers, trade associations, recruiters, you name it, you let them know that you want to serve on a board. So let's just wrap up our conversation today with a few personal stories from our panelists about how each one of them got on their first board. So Jeff, let's start with you.
My first board was on a closely held cloud services company in San Francisco, whose CEO was the founder and majority shareholder. I'd met him in a CEO group several years prior and gotten to know him over that period of time. He liked how I thought about governance, management, strategy, and so on. So when it came time for him to raise money and form a professional board, he came to me and asked me to be his chair. And I was happy to do it.
Ken, what about you?
One of the things I think being a great CFO is great training.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. And my first board experience was joining the board of a foundation, which I continue to be an active board member. I was working with an attorney at the time who mentioned he was looking for board members for his newly formed foundation and in the clean energy space, and for someone to head their audit committee. So that's what I did.
Perfect. How about you, Ron?
Well, for me, it was actually a large nonprofit board that I was introduced to by one of my colleagues who was actually a public company board member, but he was also sitting on this nonprofit board. So that was how I got my first one.
Terrific. So I think the lesson learned for our audience is if you want to join a board, stay connected to your networks. That is so important. Oftentimes you may get a call from a recruiter or a headhunting firm, and they can help you get on a board, but it's really your network that's going to serve you the best in terms of board opportunities down the road. So that's really it with regard to the content of our workshop today. And thank you, panelists, for joining us. I hope the audience enjoyed the conversation. Now let's go to the chat room and see if we have any questions by our attendees. So I'm just going to go on chat right now and see. So far, I don't see any questions, but I have a couple that we might want to chit chat about. We have a little bit of time. So how do you identify good boards versus bad boards when you're looking to join a board? How would you vet a prospective board? Does anybody want to answer that? Go ahead, Ron.
Sure, I was going to say, one of the things I think is you start to do your research. Get on LinkedIn, read about all the members, the current members of the board. Look for close relationships. See if there's relationships that are, if they're all too close, they're all friends of the CEO. They're all in the same boards. They're all in the same company. They're family related. You just don't want to have to deal with an echo chamber. So you want to look there. At least that's one of the ideas that I would think about.
Ron, I think that echo chamber concept that you mentioned now twice is key. to really doing your vetting about a board. If too many family members, too many friends, it's not the place to be.
I would also ask for corporate minutes and board presentations going back a couple of years.
Oh, that's a great idea.
You'll understand how well they prepare for board meetings, whether they prepare for board meetings, and some don't. And the minutes will tell you whether they're being thorough in their documentation of decision making.
Terrific. We have a question from Elvia Cowan. Hi, Elvia. Long time no talk to. Her question is, how much is too much nonprofit board involvement if you're trying to establish credibility as a board member? That's a great question. Who would like to answer that?
I guess I'll take a quick stab.
That's the comment.
Being on a nonprofit board is a good starting place to being on a corporate board, but they're not the same. Let's be very clear about that. The responsibilities are different. Nonprofit boards often have broad community responsibilities, which aren't necessarily the case on corporate boards. They're good training, but you do need to diversify away from just nonprofits.
I totally agree with Jeff, Elvia. What I would say is if you are on one nonprofit board, great. You don't need, to be honest with you, to join another. You want to move directly to being on a corporate board, be it a private or public company, depending upon, what your skill sets are and what you're looking for. So completely agree with that. We have another question from Christopher Williams. In your experience, what is the optimal mix in terms of capacity of private and public boards? Who would like to take on that question? Go ahead, Ken.
And just to finish off the prior question, a nonprofit board's a good place to start. You're going to learn a lot about being on a board. But to this question, what's the optimal mix? Well, one, how much capacity does one have to sit on boards? If you're actively still engaged in your primary career, then you're going to have more limited time. But if you have more time for boards, I would say maybe 25% on a private mix, maybe half public to private. I would say I would also add nonprofit, no more than 25%. But private to public, it really depends on what you want. Public boards will tend to have more structure, of course, and also have a different kind of compensation, but also a different kind of liability.
And there's actually, if I can interject there, there's
Sure.
actually, there are requirements in ISS and everything else as a public company. They have limits and recommendations as to how many boards you can actually sit on. I remember it's 3 or 4, sometimes 5, but 5 you start getting questions, and so you just need to be very careful about that also.
And I also think it depends if you have a day job, to be perfectly
Exactly.
honest with you. So you have people who are full-time members of boards, and they're probably no more than 4.
Mhm.
There's great compensation with that, but no more than 4. But that's if you're a full-time board member. If you're like all of us, mostly with day jobs, probably no more than 2 boards at any one time. And that's still a lot. And again, if you're wanting to morph to more the corporate board setting, do your nonprofit work and then move to the private or public company board setting, and no more than 2. Again, if you have a full-time job.
I would also caution people against joining a public company board unless you've had a lot of exposure to board ethics and knowledge. And that means NACD and the Stanford Directors College and so on. You are playing at a very different game and a very different level on a public board than you are on a private board. So get smart about it before you do it.
Absolutely. We have one additional question, and I think this is a doozy, and I think it's a great question addressed to anyone on the panel. So as a board member, how do you balance your close relationship with the management team or your developing relationship with the management team and your need to hold them accountable? That's a great question. Who might want to answer? Who might want to start?
You're not
Yeah.
there to be friends with them. You're there to
Exactly.
mentor, coach, and oversee them. And there's a very different role there. Just be clear about what you're doing.
I would add the word courage to being an independent board
Yeah.
member. I told the story earlier of when I was on that specialty pharma board and I raised my hand. And again, I was only 6 months on the board. I was the youngest one on the board, but I knew instinctively that the fiduciary responsibility of each member had to really be looked at in that issue of increasing those comp packages without the acquirer's approval. So courage and the ability to say, hey, this doesn't smell right, or hey, I think we need to look at this perspective, or have we had that legal counsel opinion on the issue is really, really important to do the best job you can as a board member and hold management accountable. Ken or Ron, do you have any
Yeah,
thing you want to add?
I would say it's interesting because I look back at some of the times in one of my last positions, the audit chair and I actually got on great, absolutely great. And we're good friends and everything else now. But I can tell you, he didn't stop asking me the tough questions in those meetings. And that was the right way to do it. I mean, he would ask me and we would go through a lot of detail and a lot of information to make sure that he was doing his part, which I think is it's a good example of what you should do. But you can build credibility and you can still become, over long term, you never know, you will.
We have another question, I think our last question, Simon Newman. In my experience, many boards tend to be clubby, you are right, where members are politically chosen so that a majority is being friends of or controlled by the CEO. This leads to groupthink, that echo chamber that Ron mentioned, and reluctance to dig into difficult issues. How do you advise someone to be political enough to be accepted on a board, but at the same time remain intellectually honest enough to ask the tough questions and risk causing disruption? Ken, do you want to take the first on that one?
Sure. One of the things I think Lorene had mentioned was having courage. I don't think it takes a lot of courage to do the right thing, whether you're a part of management or whether you're on a board. Inherently, if you've got the right level of integrity, which I assume everyone does, you have a good litmus test. And you cannot be afraid of going against the grain if the other board members are quote unquote clubby or they're of the same mindset. You're there to be intellectually honest and you're there to do the right thing. And if you do the right thing and you take the right approach and you ask the tough questions like Ron's board member, you know what? You're going to walk away saying, I did it the right way. And it may mean like you actually have to mix it up a little bit, but that is your responsibility as a board member.
Totally.
You cannot shy away from that.
Totally.
Also, the whole concept of how you define an independent director is shifting. The SEC and New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are all tightening that definition. And they go to questions like, do your spouses socialize? Do you belong to the same country club? Do you live down the street? Or do you not have any personal relationship with the CEO and the other board members? Don't even live in the same city, for example. It's a gray area, of course, but more independence is better than less. There's no question about it.
I would just add, if it's a particular issue, it's a throw down your badge situation.
Right.
Because you cannot compromise your integrity and your sense of doing the right thing. It only will serve you poorly if you do.
Absolutely. And I also think that the fact that we're seeing more diversity on the boards is really important as well, because it does break up the groupthink mentality. More diversity means more diversity of opinion. And I think that's really important on boards. So I think that finishes up the chat. So Elvia, Christopher, and Simon, thank you for your questions. Thank you again, attendees, for your time today. Thank you to our panelists. And just so that you're aware, we do quite a few workshops, podcast events, etc., in our leadership series. We'll be hosting another roundtable event called the Roadmap to a successful biotech exit on July 20th. We hope you join us for that. And we are hosting our first CFO Essentials workshop on October 20th, live at the Ritz-Carlton. We'll be sending you out information. We hope you join us for both of those opportunities. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Bye now.